The evening had that quiet stillness that only comes when something deep inside you already knows the change is near. I stood by the window, looking at the faint lights outside, waiting for my husband to return. It had become a habit, waiting for him, waiting for his voice, waiting for a sign that things between us were still alive. But lately, our home had turned into nothing more than walls and furniture, filled with silence that used to be laughter. When he walked through the door that night, I could sense something different in his expression. He didn't smile or ask how I was. He just said calmly, "Some friends from college are coming over tonight." His voice was steady, almost emotionless. I nodded, hiding the nervousness that began to rise in my chest. It wasn't the visit that bothered me, it was his tone, the way he said it, as if the decision had already been made long before I was told. I spent the next hour preparing. The dining table was set neatly, candles placed carefully, and soft music played in the background. I wanted everything to be perfect, not because I cared about the guests, but because a part of me still believed that maybe, just maybe, he would see my effort and remember how much I cared. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath. 3 men entered, all polite and friendly at first glance. They greeted me warmly, but something about their eyes felt uncertain, as if they weren't sure how to behave. My husband followed behind them, his face calm, unreadable. He didn't introduce them properly, he simply said, "They're old friends. Make them comfortable." Then he sat down, quietly observing. As I served the tea, I tried to start light conversation. The men asked about the house, about life in the city, about small things that didn't matter. But every time I glanced at my husband, I felt uneasy. He wasn't engaging with them the way friends normally would. He just watched them, watched me, and said very little. It was as if he was analyzing every movement, every word. The air inside the house began to feel heavier. The laughter of the guests sounded forced, their smiles fading quickly after each sentence. My husband's silence filled the space between us, and no one dared to question it. I poured more tea, my hands trembling slightly as I did. The sound of the spoon tapping against the cup felt louder than usual, echoing in the tension that had settled in the room. At one point, one of his friends asked, "You two seem to have a peaceful life here." My husband's lips curved into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Peaceful," he repeated softly. "Yes, you could call it that." The way he said it made me stop in my tracks. There was something unsettling behind his words, something cold that I couldn't name. The night dragged on slowly. Every moment felt stretched, as though time itself had begun to move differently. My husband didn't speak much, but I could feel his gaze following me, calm yet piercing. When I caught his eyes once, he looked away immediately, pretending to adjust his watch. The gesture was small, but it said everything. There was distance between us, an invisible wall that I hadn't noticed growing over the years, and now it stood tall and unbreakable. When I finally sat down, pretending to listen to the conversation, my mind wandered. I remembered the man he used to be, the one who brought me flowers just because, who laughed at my clumsy cooking, who stayed up late telling stories about his dreams. That man had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by this quiet stranger sitting across from me. The guests didn't stay late. Around 11, they began to say their goodbyes, their voices low, their smiles uneasy. My husband stood up, shook their hands, and followed them to the door. I stayed behind, cleaning the table slowly, pretending not to notice how none of them looked back as they left. When the door finally closed, silence returned. My husband stood still for a moment, then turned toward me. His face was calm, his tone gentle. "You did well," he said softly. I didn't know what he meant by that, and before I could ask, he walked past me and went straight to the bedroom. I stood alone in the dim light, the ticking clock echoing in the background. Something inside me told me that tonight was not about old friends or casual visits. It was about something deeper, something I hadn't yet understood. And though the evening had ended, I could feel it. Our story had just begun to unravel. The night after they left, the house felt different. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, as if every wall had absorbed the tension that no one had spoken about. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying my husband's expression, the way he'd sat there, silent, watching everything with a strange calmness. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something about that evening had been staged. It hadn't felt like a casual visit among friends. It had felt like a test, but I didn't know what I was being tested for. The next morning, I woke up early and began cleaning the house. Every plate, every chair, every corner felt like it carried the echoes of that uncomfortable night. My husband sat at the table, drinking tea quietly. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask if I had slept. His silence had become a language of its own, and I was tired of trying to translate it. "Your friend seemed nice," I finally said, hoping to start a conversation. He looked up at me slowly and gave a faint smile. "They're old friends," he said simply, and then looked back down at his cup. The calmness in his tone bothered me more than anger ever could. I wanted to ask what he meant by "you did well last night," but I was afraid of the answer. The days that followed were strangely quiet. My husband spent most of his time at work or sitting in the living room, lost in thought. Sometimes, I caught him staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Not with affection, not with hate, just watching. It made me uneasy, but I didn't know how to confront him. One evening, as I was folding clothes, I found an old photo album lying on his desk. It was filled with pictures of his college days, smiling faces, laughter, parties. Among them, I recognized the same friends who had visited us that night. I stared at their happy faces and wondered how those same men could have looked so tense, so uncertain, when they were here. Something about the past and present didn't fit together. When he came home that night, I asked softly, "Were they the ones you used to be closest to?" He nodded. "We went through a lot together," he said, his voice distant. I hesitated, then asked, "So why did they seem uncomfortable?" He looked at me for a moment, then said something that froze me. "Because they finally saw the truth." His words were calm, but they carried a strange weight. I wanted to ask what truth he meant, but he had already walked away. That night, I sat alone in the dark, the words echoing in my head. What truth? What had he shown them? I tried to remember every detail of that evening, the way they looked at him, the way he watched me, the silences between their questions. The realization slowly began to sink in. He had wanted them to see something, and whatever it wasn't about friendship. The next few days became unbearable. I couldn't focus on anything. His behavior remained the same, quiet, controlled, distant. Sometimes he'd look at me as though I was a character in a story he already knew the ending to. There was no warmth, no fight, no emotion left between us. One night, as I served dinner, I finally gathered the courage to ask, "What happened that night? Why did they come here?" He didn't answer immediately. He kept eating, slowly, as if deciding whether I deserved the truth. Then, without looking up, he said, "They needed to see who I really am." His answer made even less sense, but I didn't push further. Deep down, I realized it wasn't just me he had been testing, it was himself. Maybe he wanted to prove something, not to me, but to the people who once knew him best. But what he had proven, I still didn't know. When I went to bed that night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of his cold eyes haunted me. It felt as if I was living with a stranger, someone who wore my husband's face but carried none of his love. The silence between us had grown so thick that even the smallest sound, a ticking clock, the rustle of curtains, felt louder than words, and in that silence, one thought echoed endlessly in my mind. Sometimes betrayal doesn't come from a single act, it comes from the quiet distance of someone who has already stopped caring.
The thunder outside echoed faintly, distant now, as though the storm had grown tired. Inside, the house was wrapped in a stillness that felt almost too heavy to breathe through. The candlelight flickered, casting soft, golden shadows that seemed to move in rhythm with my heartbeat. He stood up to close the window, the cool air slipping past him, and for a moment, I watched him without meaning to. There was something steady and calm about the way he moved. Familiar, yet suddenly unfamiliar. When he turned back toward me, his eyes lingered longer than before. It wasn't a look of curiosity anymore. It was something else, deeper, quieter, but unmistakable. I felt my chest tighten as he came closer, not hurriedly, not carelessly, but with a gentleness that made it impossible to look away. He stopped a few steps away, the soft light outlining his face, his expression uncertain but open, as if waiting for me to decide what happened next. I could hear my own pulse, loud in the silence. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I should have said something, should have moved, but I didn't. He reached out, slowly, carefully, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers brushed my cheek, light as air, yet the touch burned into my skin. My breath caught. The room seemed to shrink until it was only him and me. No sound, no thought, just that fragile space between restraint and surrender. He whispered my name once, not asking, not pressing, just saying it like a confession. That single sound broke something inside me. My hand found his without thinking, and the silence between us dissolved. There were no words left, only the quiet rhythm of two people caught between what they wanted and what they shouldn't want. The rain outside softened into a drizzle. The world had fallen away. For a moment, everything else stopped. The questions, the fear, even the guilt. What remained was a warmth, a closeness that felt both right and wrong all at once. It wasn't wild or reckless. It was slow, hesitant, almost reverent. The kind of connection that exists only in moments no one is meant to see. When the candle finally flickered low, the shadows on the wall faded into stillness. I sat there, my thoughts scattered, my heart unsteady. He was beside me, silent, his hand still wrapped around mine. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to explain, nothing to name. The line we had crossed lay somewhere behind us now, invisible yet permanent. Long after the house had gone quiet, I remained awake, staring at the dim outline of the window. The storm had passed, but inside, something had changed forever. Morning arrived softly, with pale sunlight slipping through the curtains and painting the room in a muted glow. The storm was gone, leaving behind only damp air and the faint smell of rain. For a few quiet moments, I didn't move. I just lay there, listening to the silence that felt heavier than it had the night before. Everything around me looked the same, but nothing felt the same anymore. The warmth that had filled the room last night had turned into something quieter, something that ached. He was already awake, sitting near the edge of the bed, his gaze fixed on the window. When he turned to look at me, there was no surprise in his eyes, only understanding, the kind that doesn't need words. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There wasn't anything left to say. The night had already said everything it needed to. He stood up and walked to the kitchen, his footsteps soft against the floor. I could hear the faint clink of cups, the sound of boiling water. It was such an ordinary sound, yet it felt strange now, as if ordinary things no longer belonged to us. When he came back with 2 cups of coffee, I managed a small smile. We sat together in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The air between us was calm but fragile, as if the wrong word could break it apart. When it was time for me to leave, he didn't try to stop me, and I didn't ask him to. We both knew this was the only way it could end, quietly, without promises, without pretending it hadn't happened. He followed me to the door, his expression unreadable but kind. I turned to him one last time, tried to hold his gaze without letting my emotions show. "Thank you," I said softly, though I wasn't sure for what. The shelter, the company, or the silence. He nodded, his eyes gentle but tired. "Take care," he said, and that was all. Outside, the world had returned to normal. The street was wet but bright, the air fresh after the rain. Each step I took away from his house felt heavier than the last. By the time I reached my own door, the memory of the night had already begun to fade into that strange, quiet space where secrets live. I sat down by the window, watching sunlight spill across the floor. Everything looked peaceful, but inside, I carried something I couldn't name, a memory, a mistake, a moment that wouldn't let go. It wasn't love, not really, but it wasn't nothing either. It was the kind of connection that exists only once, born out of loneliness, lost in the morning light, and buried in silence. Some nights change everything without making a sound. This was one of them.